Have you ever faced a moment where everything you believed, every truth you held sacred, shattered before your eyes? Imagine standing on the precipice of certainty, only for the ground to crumble beneath you, revealing a chasm of terrifying unknowns. This isn't just about losing a battle. It's about losing your entire understanding of what war is, what an enemy is, and even who you are. This is the story of Guadalcanal, where the Imperial Japanese Army, a force believed invincible, encountered something they simply could not comprehend: a new, terrifying breed of warfare, unleashed by America in the unforgiving crucible of the jungle. For years, since 1937, the Japanese war machine had known nothing but triumph. From the vast plains of China to the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia, their disciplined, fanatical troops, imbued with an unwavering warrior spirit, had swept aside all opposition. They had mastered the art of the swift, brutal night attack, their bayonet charges and close-quarters ferocity legendary. They believed themselves superior, not just in will, but in tactical prowess. Western armies, they observed, were soft, reliant on machines, and prone to panic under pressure. America, in particular, was seen as a luxury-loving nation, its soldiers ill-prepared for the rigors of true combat. This deep-seated conviction, almost an ideological certainty, would become their greatest vulnerability. Then came August 7th, 1942. Deep within the suffocating embrace of the Solomon Islands, an almost unimaginable sight unfolded. 11,000 United States Marines of the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore at Lunga Point on an island called Guadalcanal. This wasn't just a skirmish. This was Operation Watchtower, America's first major offensive of the Pacific War. Their immediate objective: seize a Japanese airfield, nearly completed, which sat like a festering wound on the island's coastal plain. On paper, it seemed straightforward. In reality, they were diving headfirst into an abyss. Guadalcanal itself was a vision of tropical purgatory. 90 miles long, 25 miles wide, its interior was a jagged spine of mountains shrouded in perpetual cloud. The coastal strip, where the airfield lay, was a tangled nightmare of kunai grass, festering swamps, and jungle so dense that visibility could drop to mere feet. The heat was a living entity, suffocating and relentless, with humidity rarely dipping below 90%. Mosquitoes, thick as fog, swarmed in clouds, so pervasive that men found themselves inhaling them with every gasp for air. The rivers, deceptively clear in reconnaissance photos, teemed with parasites and disease. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and grotesque tropical ulcers would, over the coming months, incapacitate more men than enemy bullets. Yet, in those initial moments, the Marines found the airfield almost undefended. Japanese construction workers and naval troops, caught by surprise, fled into the jungle, abandoning their equipment, their supplies, and crucially, the almost completed runway. Within hours, American engineers were already transforming it, eventually naming it Henderson Field, a vital tribute to a Marine aviator lost at Midway. Soon, the first American aircraft would land, and the Cactus Air Force was born, an aerial thorn in Japan's side. The Japanese response was swift, brutal, and initially catastrophic for the Americans. Just 2 nights after the landings, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa executed a brilliant surprise attack, leading his cruisers and a destroyer through the darkness. The ensuing Battle of Savo Island was a crushing defeat for the United States Navy. 4 heavy cruisers, including the USS Quincy and USS Vincennes, were sent to the bottom in under an hour, taking over 1,000 sailors with them into the flaming waters. The remaining Allied naval forces, reeling from the blow, withdrew, taking with them most of the supplies that hadn't yet been unloaded. The Marines were stranded, cut off, facing a reinforced enemy with barely half their equipment and dwindling food. This was the moment the myth of American softness should have been confirmed. This was the chance for Japan to sweep them into the sea. But their high command, focused on the immediate naval victory, failed to grasp the new reality. Henderson Field had become the ultimate prize. Control of that airfield meant control of the surrounding seas during daylight hours, allowing American aircraft to strike any Japanese ship within a 200-mile radius. This single, undeniable fact would unilaterally dictate the entire nature of the campaign. The Japanese could own the night, using fast destroyers, christened the Tokyo Express, to ferry troops and supplies under the cloak of darkness. But with the rising sun, American aircraft reclaimed the skies, making large-scale daylight naval movements a suicide mission. The strategic imperative for Japan was clear. Henderson Field must be retaken, and immediately, before the Americans could fortify their position. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army, based at Rabaul, was given the daunting task. However, Hyakutake's forces were stretched thin across the Pacific. The closest available unit was Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, originally slated for the ill-fated Midway operation. Ichiki himself was an infantry school instructor, renowned for his tactical acumen, but also notorious for his impulsiveness and an almost spiritual faith in the superiority of Japanese fighting spirit over American materiel. Before departing Truk for Guadalcanal, Ichiki received clear, explicit orders. Wait for the rest of his regiment to arrive before attempting to assault the airfield. But Ichiki had little respect for American soldiers. His studies of previous encounters, from China to the Philippines, reinforced his ingrained belief. Americans lacked discipline. They broke under pressure. They simply could not match Japanese warriors in close combat, especially at night. "These are Americans," he had declared to his officers, echoing a sentiment widely held. "We will sweep them into the sea before sunrise." On the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers delivered 917 men, the first element of Ichiki's detachment, to Taivu Point, a secluded beach some 15 miles east of the American perimeter. The landing went flawlessly, utterly undetected. Ichiki, wasting no time, immediately dispatched reconnaissance patrols to assess enemy strength and positions. It was a standard tactical decision that would, in retrospect, prove to be a fatal misstep. The next day, August 19th, a patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, led by Captain Charles Brush, was meticulously working its way along the coastal track towards Coley Point. They moved with the heightened senses of men in hostile territory, every rustle of the leaves, every distant chirp, an amplified warning. Suddenly, through the oppressive humidity and tangled undergrowth, they spotted them, Japanese soldiers. The two forces collided in a brief, brutal firefight. The Marines, though surprised, reacted with precision and ferocity, killing 31 Japanese soldiers. More importantly, they captured crucial documents. These papers were a goldmine of intelligence, revealing the presence of a significant enemy force in the area, and perhaps most critically, the stunning revelation that the Japanese severely underestimated American strength. Captain Brush, clutching his intelligence haul, raced back to the perimeter. General Alexander Van de Grift, commander of the 1st Marine Division, understood immediately the gravity, the intelligence. An attack was coming, and soon, most likely from the east. He acted with decisive speed, ordering Colonel Clifton Cates to immediately strengthen defenses along the sandbar at the mouth of what the Marines called the Tanaru River. It was actually the Ilu River, but the misidentification, often the way of war, would stick in history. Have Kate deployed Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, along the riverbank. They positioned their machine guns with methodical, almost surgical precision, ensuring interlocking fields of fire that would sweep across the sandbar, leaving no inch uncovered. What was about to unfold would etch itself into Marine Corps history as one of the most one-sided and horrifying battles ever fought. Colonel Ichiki, driven by his unwavering confidence and perhaps a touch of hubris, chose not to wait. He dismissed the reports of his lost patrol, ignored the need for reinforcements. His orders had been to wait, but the opportunity, he believed, was now. On the night of August 20th, stretching into the early morning of August 21st, he launched a frontal assault directly across that prepared sandbar. Japanese military doctrine emphasized the almost mystical superiority of spiritual power and the aggressive, disorienting force of night attacks, designed to overwhelm enemy firepower through sheer audacity. Ichiki believed his battle-hardened veterans, with their bayonets and grenades, could simply break through the American lines in close-quarters combat, where the Japanese excelled. But as midnight approached, a ghostly figure stumbled into the Marine lines. A Solomon Islands scout named Jacob Vuza. He had escaped Japanese captivity after hours of torture, his body scarred, but his spirit unbroken. His message was stark, chilling. Japanese are coming. Minutes later, the jungle erupted. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers surged across the sandbar, their chilling battle cries, "Banzai!" tearing through the humid air. They fired their rifles, hurled grenades, a wave of human ferocity aimed at shattering the American resolve. But they ran headfirst into a meticulously prepared killing zone. The M1917A1 Browning water-cooled machine guns, weapons perfected in the trenches of World War I, opened fire. These weren't just firearms. They were instruments of sustained, overwhelming destruction, capable of spitting out 600 rounds per minute, indefinitely, as long as their water jackets were full and ammunition supplied. The Marines had positioned them in mutually supporting arcs, creating a crisscrossing curtain of heavy .30 caliber rounds that tore through flesh and bone. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers fell. The sandbar became a charnel house, a conveyor belt of death. Those few who managed to make it across the deadly gauntlet encountered more horrors. 37mm anti-tank guns, loaded not with armor-piercing shells, but with canister rounds. Imagine a giant shotgun shell unleashing hundreds of steel pellets in a cone of pure destruction. These weapons turned charging men into shredded meat. The attack continued for hours, a relentless, suicidal charge against an unbreakable wall of fire. Some Japanese soldiers, through sheer desperation and courage, reached the Marine positions, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Marines fought with rifles, knives, fists, anything available, but the defensive preparations held. The interlocking fields of fire created an impenetrable barrier, preventing any breakthrough. As dawn painted the eastern sky, Colonel Ichiki's attack had completely stalled. More than 800 of his men lay dead or dying on the sandbar and in the shallow, blood-stained water. Daybreak brought no respite for the surviving Japanese. General Vandegrift ordered a counterattack. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks, rumbling across the sandbar, began systematically hunting down Japanese soldiers who had taken cover in the coconut groves. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis, observing the grim scene, described it with chilling detail. It was fascinating to see them bustling amongst the trees, pivoting, turning, spitting sheets of yellow flame. We had not realized there were so many Japanese in the grove. Group after group were flushed out, cut down by the tank's canister shells. By midday on August 21st, the Battle of the Tanaru was over. Of the 917 Japanese soldiers who had landed, approximately 800 were dead. About 128 survivors, mostly from support units that had wisely stayed near the landing site, melted into the unforgiving jungle. They would send a radio message to the 17th Army headquarters, a stark, horrifying report of utter disaster. Colonel Ichiki himself was among the dead. Accounts differ on his final moments, some claiming ritual suicide, others that he died leading a final desperate charge. Marine casualties, in stark contrast, were approximately 40 killed and wounded. The psychological impact on the surviving Japanese was devastating. Captured documents and post-war accounts consistently revealed the profound shock of learning that an entire regiment, a proud unit of the Imperial Army, had been annihilated in a single night. The Americans had not fought according to Japanese predictions. They had not panicked under night attack. They had not broken when charged by screaming warriors. Instead, they had waited, disciplined and resolute, in prepared positions, allowed the Japanese to enter their carefully constructed killing zones, and then systematically destroyed them with concentrated firepower. But the most devastating revelation came from examining captured equipment and assessing the battlefield itself. The Americans possessed a level of material wealth that Japanese intelligence had utterly failed to comprehend. The Browning machine guns never jammed, never overheated beyond their designed capacity, never failed from poor maintenance or inadequate spare parts. Every Marine seemed to carry more ammunition than an entire Japanese squad. The artillery support the Marines could call upon exceeded anything the Japanese could deploy, and the coordination between infantry, artillery, and even naval gunfire from ships offshore represented an integrated system of destruction that Japanese forces had never, in their wildest nightmares, encountered. This wasn't just a fight between men. It was a collision between two fundamentally different philosophies of warfare, one built on spirit, the other on systems. Within days of the Tanaru disaster, more Japanese forces were already en route to Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, recognizing the critical situation, organized a massive naval operation to support the next attempt to retake Henderson Field. However, initial attempts to use slow transport ships proved too vulnerable to the nascent Cactus Air Force. After heavy damage to one transport during the naval battle of the Eastern Solomons, Japanese command decided to abandon slow ships entirely. Instead, they would rely solely on destroyers for what became known as the Tokyo Express runs. Between August 29th and September 4th, destroyers and light cruisers delivered almost 5,000 troops of Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Taivu Point. The Tokyo Express was a brilliant logistical improvisation for moving men. Destroyers could make the round trip from the Shortland Islands to Guadalcanal in a single night, minimizing exposure to American air attacks. But this method harbored a critical, ultimately fatal weakness. Heavy equipment could not be transported this way. Artillery pieces, tanks, trucks, and most importantly, adequate food and ammunition had to be left behind. This logistical reality would become the silent, insidious killer, ultimately dooming every Japanese offensive on Guadalcanal. Soldiers arrived with only what they could carry. They depended on local foraging, the island's meager bounty, and whatever supplies could be infiltrated through American lines. As the campaign wore on, Japanese troops would find themselves fighting not just against American firepower, but against the insidious, gnawing terror of starvation itself. General Kawaguchi, a more cautious and tactically sophisticated commander than Ichiki, set September 12th as the date for his assault yacht on Henderson Field. His plan was ambitious, calling for a three-pronged attack: One force would strike from the west along the coastal area. A second force would attack from the south, attempting to penetrate through dense jungle to strike at what Japanese intelligence believed was the weakest point in American defenses. Kawaguchi himself would lead the main effort, approaching from the south along an inland ridge that offered a commanding view of Henderson Field. What Kawaguchi didn't know was that Marine intelligence, constantly probing and adapting, had already identified this ridge as the most likely avenue of approach. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding officer of the 1st Raider Battalion, a man of uncanny foresight and iron will, conducted a raid on Tasimoko village on September 8th. There he discovered massive supply dumps, a clear indication that a large Japanese force was concentrating in the area. Edson, putting the pieces together, immediately understood the Japanese plan. They would come from the south, using that ridge as their approach route. He requested and received permission from General Vandegrift to establish a defensive line on the ridge itself. On September 10th and 11th, Edson meticulously positioned approximately 840 Marines from his Raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion along the ridge. He selected defensive positions with the same methodical care that had characterized the Tanaru defenses. Machine guns were emplaced to create interlocking fields of fire. Mortar crews pre-registered their fire on likely approach routes. Artillery from the 11th Marines plotted defensive fire missions, their shells ready to rain down at a moment's notice. Every advantage of terrain and firepower was calculated and prepared. The ridge itself was a narrow coral spine, about 1,000 meters long, consisting of 3 distinct hills covered with treacherous kunai grass and scattered trees. Deep, heavily wooded ravines, in some places almost impenetrable, bordered both sides. It was the perfect terrain for a night attack by infiltrating infantry. It was also, if properly defended, a killing ground. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's forces began their assault. Unlike Ichiki's suicidal frontal charge, this was a more sophisticated, nuanced attack. Japanese infantry infiltrated through the ravines on both sides of the ridge, attempting to envelop the American positions. Small units probed for weak points, and when they found them, larger forces concentrated for breakthrough attempts. The fighting was savage, confused, and utterly terrifying. In the inky blackness, Marines sometimes found themselves engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat with Japanese soldiers who had infiltrated to within grenade range. But again, the defensive preparations held. When Japanese forces concentrated for breakthrough attempts, Marine mortars and artillery shattered them. The 11th Marines fired more than 2,000 rounds during the night, dropping high-explosive shells so close to Marine positions that shrapnel wounded friendly troops. Machine gun crews fired until their barrels glowed cherry red in the darkness, the metal protesting the sustained torrent of death. Individual Marines fought with rifles, pistols, knives, entrenching tools, anything that came to hand. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, the same scout who had warned of the Tanaru attack, moved through the lines, a beacon of courage, encouraging Marines and pointing out Japanese infiltration routes. Sergeant John Basiloni manned a machine gun position that became absolutely critical to the defense. When his gun crews were killed or wounded, Basiloni, fueled by adrenaline and sheer will, continued firing alone, repelling wave after wave of desperate Japanese attacks. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for his extraordinary actions that night. 2 Marines would earn the Medal of Honor at Edson's Ridge, and 19 would receive the Navy Cross, a testament to the brutal ferocity of the combat. As dawn broke on September 13th, the Japanese attack had failed to break through, but Kawaguchi had more troops available and grimly prepared to renew the assault the following night. Edson, ever the pragmatist, pulled his lines back to the center of the ridge, consolidating his forces. General Vandegrift, understanding the desperate struggle, sent reinforcements, bringing the total defending force to approximately 2,500 men. The Japanese would attack again, but this time the Marines were ready, with even stronger positions and more concentrated firepower. The second night's fighting was even more intense than the first. Kawaguchi, his reserves dwindling, threw his remaining forces into desperate, furious attempts to break through before American reinforcements made the position impregnable. Japanese soldiers charged repeatedly, dying by the hundreds in the merciless machine gun fire. Some attacks came within 50 yards of Edson's command post before being stopped, a hair's breadth from catastrophe. At one critical moment, the situation was so desperate that Edson himself grabbed a rifle and joined the firing line, leading by example in the heart of the chaos. But again, American firepower and meticulous defensive preparation prevailed. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive had completely collapsed. Japanese casualties were staggering. Approximately 830 to 850 Japanese soldiers died on and around Edson's Ridge. Marine casualties, severe but sustainable, totaled approximately 104 killed and over 200 wounded between the Raider and Parachute battalions. The ridge, which would forever after be known as Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge, had become a monument to the devastating effectiveness of American defensive doctrine. For the Japanese soldiers who survived, the battle represented another profound shock to their understanding of warfare. Captured diaries and post-war accounts consistently described the same harrowing realization. Japanese forces had expected to fight other infantry in the darkness, where their training and spiritual power would triumph. Instead, they encountered artillery, machine guns, and mortars, all concentrated with a precision they could not match. American commanders knew the Japanese were coming. They prepared killing zones. They waited for Japanese forces to enter. Then they destroyed them with coordinated fire support. This wasn't individual prowess. This was a system. The battles at Tanaru and Bloody Ridge established patterns that would tragically repeat throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese forces would launch attacks based on courage, night tactics, and close combat expertise. American forces would respond with overwhelming firepower, coordinated combined arms operations, and defensive positions carefully prepared to maximize their advantages. The outcome, in terms of casualties, was horrifyingly predictable. Japanese casualties would be catastrophic. American casualties would be significant, but crucially, sustainable. But numbers alone cannot truly capture the horror of jungle warfare on Guadalcanal. The environment itself became a weapon, killing with chilling impartiality. Malaria infected nearly every man who spent more than a few weeks on the island. By December 1942, the 1st Marine Division would report over 8,000 malaria cases. Tropical diseases disabled approximately 2/3 of the division. Dysentery was universal, a constant, debilitating affliction. Men suffered from fungal infections that ate through their skin, and jungle rot caused open sores that simply would not heal in the humid, oppressive heat. Dental problems without any treatment led to agonizing abscessed teeth and systemic infections. The Japanese suffered even worse. Their supply situation, a direct consequence of the Tokyo Express's limitations, meant inadequate food from the very beginning. Soldiers were supposed to receive field rations, but the destroyers could rarely deliver enough. Men subsisted on whatever they could forage from the unforgiving jungle: roots, leaves, anything remotely edible, supplemented by occasional rice deliveries that had to be stretched impossibly thin, a single rice ball expected to sustain a man for an entire day. Starvation became a constant, agonizing companion. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Quinine for malaria prevention ran out quickly and was never adequately resupplied. Wounded soldiers often died from infections that would have been easily treatable with proper medicine, their bodies succumbing not to enemy bullets, but to the insidious, microscopic enemies within their own flesh. Japanese documents captured later in the campaign painted a horrifying, visceral picture of the conditions. A medical officer's report from late October noted that more than 60% of the 17th Army's forces on Guadalcanal were incapacitated by disease or malnutrition. Combat effectiveness had dropped to perhaps 30% of authorized strength. Soldiers were dying at a rate of 50 per day, most from starvation and disease rather than combat wounds. Imagine the psychological toll of seeing your comrades not fall in a heroic charge but slowly wither away, consumed by the jungle and their own hunger. In stark contrast, American supply ships, protected by Henderson Field aircraft during daylight hours, regularly delivered food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. While shortages occurred, particularly in August and early September, when naval defeats temporarily cut off the Marines, these were temporary setbacks. By October, the flow of supplies had become reliable. Marines ate canned rations that, while not appetizing, provided adequate calories and nutrition. Ammunition was plentiful enough that machine gunners could fire until their barrels literally wore out, then request replacements. Medical care included field hospitals with surgical capabilities, plasma for blood transfusions, sulfa drugs for infection, and eventual evacuation of serious cases to rear-area hospitals. Japanese logistics, on the other hand, consisted of whatever could be carried on destroyer decks or infiltrated through American lines. Soldiers learned to make a single rice ball last an entire day or more. Ammunition was conserved to the point that orders often restricted fire to only when absolutely necessary, a terrifying constraint in a firefight. Medical care meant a bandage if you were lucky, an amputation without anesthesia if you were unlucky, or death if your wound became infected. Seriously wounded soldiers were often given grenades and left behind to commit suicide rather than burden their units or risk the shame of capture. This was not just a difference in supplies. It was a difference in valuing human life, a stark cultural divide magnified by the brutality of war. In late October, the Japanese mounted their largest offensive of the campaign, a desperate attempt to turn the tide. General Hyakutake himself came to Guadalcanal to personally command the operation. He brought elements of the 2nd Division, including experienced troops from China, veterans hardened by years of combat. The plan called for coordinated attacks from multiple directions, with the main effort coming from the south through dense jungle, similar to the Bloody Ridge approach. This time, however, Japanese forces would have more men, better coordination, and crucially, artillery support that had finally been delivered via destroyers, piece by painstaking piece. The offensive began on October 23rd with a preliminary attack from the west. 9 Japanese tanks, a rare sight on Guadalcanal due to the extreme difficulty of transporting them, led an assault across the Matanacao River. American defenders, including elements of the newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment from the American Division, were ready. Anti-tank guns, artillery, and even an M3 Stuart tank quickly and efficiently knocked out all 9 Japanese tanks in quick succession. The attack collapsed with heavy casualties, a chilling replay of the Tanaru. The main assault came on the night of October 24th to 25th. Approximately 5,600 Japanese troops under Major General Yumio Nasu attacked from the south, hoping to break through American lines south of Henderson Field. They faced the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, under the legendary Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, reinforced by elements of the 164th Infantry Regiment. The fighting that night became legendary in Marine Corps history, a desperate, swirling maelstrom of courage and carnage. Japanese attacks came in relentless waves throughout the night. Individual breakthroughs were sealed by immediate, ferocious counterattacks. Machine gunners fired until their weapons failed from overheating, then grabbed rifles and continued fighting. Artillery from the 11th Marines fired danger-close missions, shells landing within yards of Marine positions, a testament to the desperate nature of the defense. Offshore, the mighty battleship USS Washington stood by, its massive guns ready to provide naval gunfire support if called upon. At one critical moment, only a single Marine battalion stood between Japanese forces and Henderson Field, the fate of the entire campaign hanging by a thread. But they did not break. Sergeant John Basilone, who had already distinguished himself at Bloody Ridge, again became critical to the defense. When ammunition ran low for his machine gun section, Basilone, heedless of the incessant enemy fire, personally carried heavy belts of ammunition through the chaos to keep his guns operational. He repaired damaged machine guns under fire, his hands a blur of motion. When one gun position was overrun, he grabbed a .45 pistol and, with an almost insane courage, led a counterattack that restored the line. By dawn on October 25th, the Japanese offensive had failed. General Nasu was dead, killed by machine gun fire during one of the night attacks. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers died in the attempt to break through. American casualties were several hundred killed and wounded, severe, but once again, sustainable. October 1942 also saw major naval engagements that decisively shifted the balance of power around Guadalcanal. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, fought over 4 days from November 12th through 15th, witnessed some of the most intense surface combat in naval history. In a confused, brutal nighttime melee on November 13th, American cruisers and destroyers engaged a Japanese bombardment force that included the battleships Hiei and Kirishima. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott, the only 2 American flag officers killed in World War II surface engagements, died in the fighting. The Americans lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers. 3 more destroyers were damaged. But the Japanese lost the battleship Hiei, disabled in the night action, and sunk by aircraft the following day. More importantly, the bombardment mission failed. Henderson Field remained operational. On the night of November 14th to 15th, the battleship Kirishima attempted another bombardment, but was intercepted by the USS Washington and USS South Dakota. In a devastating display of American radar-directed gunnery, the Washington put 9 16-inch shells into Kirishima at ranges where Japanese lookouts could barely see their target. Kirishima sank with heavy loss of life, a testament to the technological edge America was developing. Perhaps most significantly, American aircraft and surface ships destroyed a Japanese convoy attempting to land the 38th Division with heavy equipment. Of 11 transport ships, only 4 reached Guadalcanal, and these were destroyed by aircraft and artillery before they could fully unload. Japanese casualties from the convoy exceeded 5,000 men. This was the last serious attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal with a large, properly equipped ground force. For Japanese troops already on the island, November marked the beginning of the agonizing end. They had expected reinforcement and resupply, the promise of victory. Instead, they learned that the naval battles had failed, that the convoys were destroyed, that no more help was coming. Rations were reduced again. Already starving men were told to survive on even less. Medical supplies that had been critically short became non-existent. The sick and wounded filled makeshift field hospitals where doctors, devoid of medicine, could do nothing except watch men die, their bodies wasting away, ravaged by disease and hunger. Captured Japanese diaries from this period painted a picture of slow, agonizing collapse. Entries described rice rations reduced to 1 ball per day, then nothing. Disease spreading everywhere. An unstoppable plague. Bodies burned when soldiers had the strength, or simply left where they fell. The horrifying, inescapable realization that no more supplies were coming. Men eating grass and bark, poisoned by unknown jungle plants, slowly deteriorating into desperate, starving shadows of their former selves. The once proud warriors were being systematically dismantled, not by bullets, but by the relentless, invisible hand of logistical failure and a hostile environment. December brought the final, brutal reckoning. Japanese command at Rabaul, facing an untenable situation, made the agonizing decision to evacuate Guadalcanal. They could not admit defeat publicly, for that was anathema to their culture. But privately, they recognized that continuing the operation meant the complete destruction of the 17th Army. Approximately 11,000 Japanese soldiers remained on the island, down from a peak strength of 36,000. Of those 11,000, perhaps 7,000 were fit enough to walk. The rest were sick, wounded, or so weakened by starvation that they could barely crawl, living ghosts haunted by their own suffering. The evacuation, designated Operation Ke, would be one of the most successful Japanese operations of the entire war. Using destroyer runs similar to the Tokyo Express, Japanese naval forces, with remarkable efficiency under immense pressure, extracted 10,052 men over 3 nights in early February 1943. It was a remarkable achievement, a testament to their skill and determination, but it could not disguise the magnitude of the defeat. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal reached a peak strength of approximately 36,000 personnel. Of these, roughly 25,000 to 30,000 died, about 14,800 killed in combat, and a staggering 10,000 to 15,000 from disease and starvation. American casualties were also severe, but sustainable. The Marines and Army units that fought on Guadalcanal lost approximately 1,600 killed in action, 4,200 wounded, and several thousand more temporarily disabled by tropical diseases. But American industry and manpower could replace these losses. New divisions were already training. Ships and aircraft were being produced faster than they could be lost. The strategic initiative had permanently shifted. The psychological impact of Guadalcanal on Japanese military thought cannot be overstated. For the first time, Japanese forces had been decisively defeated in sustained ground combat. Every offensive had failed. Every attempt to apply traditional Japanese tactical doctrine, honed over decades of victory, had resulted in catastrophic casualties. The revelation that American forces were not only materially superior, but also tactically competent, well-led, and capable of enduring terrible conditions, shattered pre-war assumptions, like an ice sculpture melting in the tropical heat. Japanese officers who survived Guadalcanal and later wrote memoirs or were interviewed after the war consistently emphasized several recurring themes. First, they had completely underestimated American fighting qualities, both their individual courage and their collective resilience. Second, the disparity in equipment and supplies was far greater than intelligence had suggested, a chasm that widened with every passing week. Third, Japanese logistics were fundamentally inadequate for sustained operations against an enemy that controlled the sea and the air. Fourth, and perhaps most painfully, spiritual power and individual tactical skill, while admirable, were utterly insufficient against systematic disadvantages in firepower and resources. Post-war accounts from Japanese veterans revealed a consistent, heartbreaking assessment. They had believed they were superior warriors. They trained harder, accepted death more readily, mastered night fighting and close combat. But on Guadalcanal, they learned a brutal, undeniable truth. War is ultimately decided by systems. The Americans had systems for everything. Systems for supply, for medical care, for artillery support, for air coordination. Every system functioned, even if sometimes imperfectly. Japanese systems failed because they were never built properly in the first place, or were inherently fragile, collapsing under the sustained pressure of modern industrial warfare. Japanese veterans who survived the campaign and were later interviewed provided detailed accounts that fundamentally contradicted official Japanese explanations for defeat. They acknowledged that American forces fought superbly at night when defending prepared positions, not panicking, but delivering overwhelming fire. They admitted Americans endured malaria, dysentery, and terrible conditions while maintaining combat effectiveness because their logistics supported them, allowing them to fight the disease, not just the enemy. They recognized that American firepower was overwhelming, coordinated, and precisely delivered. A single American battalion, they concluded, had more effective firepower than an entire Japanese regiment. The technical aspects of American superiority were indeed significant. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal fought primarily with Arisaka rifles, bolt-action weapons requiring manual cycling between shots, limiting their rate of fire. American Marines initially carried M1903 Springfield rifles, also bolt-action, but these were rapidly supplemented by the M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle as they became available. The Garand's 8-round capacity and semi-automatic operation provided a decisive advantage in firefights, allowing Marines to put significantly more lead downrange. Machine guns told an even starker story. The American M1917A1 Browning was water-cooled and could sustain fire indefinitely, as long as water and ammunition were available. Japanese machine guns, primarily the Type 96 and Type 99, were lighter and more portable, designed for offensive movement, but critically lacked sustained fire capability, quickly overheating. In defensive positions, this difference was absolutely decisive, turning American lines into impenetrable walls of lead. Artillery superiority was perhaps most significant of all. The 11th Marines operated M1A1 pack howitzers, versatile 75mm weapons that could be broken down and transported through the arduous jungle terrain. These provided responsive, accurate fire support. Forward observers with infantry units could call for fire missions and receive rounds within minutes, adjusting them with precision. Japanese artillery on Guadalcanal was limited, incredibly difficult to move through the jungle, and chronically short of ammunition. Naval gunfire added another dimension that Japanese forces simply could not match. Destroyers and cruisers offshore could deliver devastating bombardments on Japanese positions or provide responsive fire support for Marine ground units. Radio communication between shore-based observers and naval ships allowed for precise targeting, transforming the Pacific Ocean into a giant, floating artillery platform. Air power became increasingly dominant as the campaign progressed. The Cactus Air Force, operating from Henderson Field under terrible conditions, gradually established air superiority over Guadalcanal. Marine and Army Air Force pilots flying F-4F Wildcats, P-39 Airacobras, and P-40 Warhawks intercepted Japanese bomber raids. SBD Dauntless dive bombers struck Japanese positions, supply ships, and troop concentrations with deadly accuracy. Japanese air forces from Rabaul had to fly at the extreme limits of their range, giving them minimal time over target and little ability to sustain operations. The Americans, with a close air base, simply outlasted and overwhelmed them. The final American ground offensive in January 1943 demonstrated how completely the balance had shifted. Major General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps, now including both Marine and Army divisions, launched coordinated attacks that systematically reduced the remaining Japanese positions. The offensive had overwhelming support from artillery, air power, and naval gunfire. Japanese resistance, while determined and courageous, was hampered by starvation, disease, and chronic ammunition shortages. On February 9, 1943, American patrols discovered that Japanese forces had evacuated. General Patch sent his famous understated message to Admiral William Halsey: "Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal." The campaign was over. 6 months of brutal, grinding fighting had resulted in the first major American ground victory against Japan. More importantly, it established patterns and revealed truths that would shape the rest of the Pacific War. The lessons Japanese survivors took from Guadalcanal were devastating to their pre-war military doctrine. The myth of Japanese warrior superiority had been utterly shattered. Individual courage and tactical skill, while present in abundance, were inadequate against systematic disadvantages. Night attacks and close combat, the hallmarks of Japanese tactical success in China, failed repeatedly against American defensive positions. Supply and logistics were not secondary concerns, but fundamental requirements for sustained combat. Air and naval superiority, they learned, determined outcomes on land. These lessons, learned in blood and starvation on Guadalcanal, should have fundamentally reformed Japanese military thinking. Some officers, like Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a staff officer who visited Guadalcanal during the campaign, recognized the implications. He wrote afterward that Japan needed to completely reassess its strategy. The Americans, he observed with chilling clarity, were fighting an industrial war where material production determined outcomes. Japan, with its limited industrial capacity, simply could not win an industrial war against the unstoppable productive power of America. But Japanese military culture, built on generations of tradition and recent victories, could not easily accept such fundamental revision. The official explanation for Guadalcanal blamed inadequate supplies, naval defeats, and the unexpected strength of American defenses. It did not acknowledge that Japanese tactical doctrine itself was flawed, that the entire conception of warfare that had served Japan well against China was obsolete against a modern, industrial opponent. Pride and a deep-seated denial prevented the necessary adaptation. Those Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and were later captured, or who survived the war itself, became witnesses to a transformation they never expected. They had entered the campaign as confident warriors of an invincible empire. They left as starving, disease-ridden survivors of a catastrophic defeat. Many later described Guadalcanal as the moment they first understood that Japan would lose the war, a horrifying epiphany born of first-hand experience. Post-war testimonies from Japanese veterans captured this profound psychological transformation. They acknowledged learning truths that their leaders had hidden. The Americans were not weak but overwhelmingly strong, not just in weapons, but in organization, logistics, leadership, and the ability to sustain combat operations. Japanese forces fought with courage and skill. It did not matter. American forces fought with systems and resources Japanese forces could not match. The American perspective on Guadalcanal emphasized different but equally vital lessons. For the Marines and soldiers who fought there, the campaign proved that American forces could match Japanese troops in the brutality of jungle combat. The mythology of Japanese invincibility was destroyed. American defensive doctrine worked. Combined arms coordination was effective. Individual American soldiers, properly trained and equipped, were more than capable of defeating Japanese forces. But Americans also learned respect for Japanese soldiers as tough, determined, skilled adversaries who would fight to the death rather than surrender. The willingness of Japanese forces to continue attacking in the face of hopeless odds, to endure starvation rather than give up, to die rather than retreat, made a profound impression. The contrast between the two sides' approaches to prisoner welfare and surrender illustrated fundamental cultural differences. American forces made efforts to encourage Japanese surrender, dropping leaflets, broadcasting radio messages, offering medical care and food to prisoners. These efforts had minimal success. Of approximately 36,000 Japanese troops who served on Guadalcanal, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive, and most of those were too sick or wounded to resist. The strategic implications of Guadalcanal extended far beyond the island itself. Japan's failure to retake Henderson Field and the eventual evacuation demonstrated that the Japanese defensive perimeter could, indeed, be penetrated. Allied strategy decisively shifted from defensive operations to offensive campaigns. The industrial and material advantages that America possessed could be translated into military victory if applied systematically. For Japan, Guadalcanal marked the beginning of the end. The loss of experienced troops, pilots, and ships could not be replaced at anything approaching the rate America was producing new forces. The decision to evacuate admitted, however quietly, that Japan could not sustain attritional warfare against American industrial might. The veterans of Guadalcanal, on both sides, carried their experiences for the rest of their lives. American Marines and soldiers who survived the campaign became cadres for new units, passing along hard-won lessons about jungle warfare, defensive tactics, and combined arms coordination. The 1st Marine Division, pulled off Guadalcanal in December 1942, required months of rest and rehabilitation before returning to combat, a testament to the sheer physical and psychological toll. Japanese survivors faced an even grimmer future. Those evacuated during Operation Care were dispersed to other units throughout the Pacific, carrying with them the psychological burden of defeat and the chilling knowledge that American forces were far more formidable than pre-war propaganda had suggested. Many would die in subsequent battles as Japan's strategic position continued to deteriorate. The island of Guadalcanal itself bore the scars of 6 months of intense combat for decades afterward. Wrecked aircraft, destroyed vehicles, abandoned equipment, and unexploded ordnance littered the jungles and coastal areas, silent monuments to the immense human effort and suffering. Henderson Field, expanded and improved during and after the campaign, served as a major Allied base for subsequent operations in the Solomons, a springboard for further pushes into the Pacific. For military historians and strategists, Guadalcanal provided invaluable case studies in amphibious operations, jungle warfare, logistics, air-ground coordination, and the integration of naval power with land operations. The campaign demonstrated unequivocally that modern warfare required more than just brave soldiers and tactical skill. It demanded industrial capacity, effective logistics, technological superiority, and the ability to sustain operations over extended periods against a determined foe. The human cost of Guadalcanal was staggering on both sides. More than 7,000 American and Japanese servicemen died in the naval battles around the island. On land, American casualties exceeded 7,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Japanese losses exceeded 30,000 from all causes, a truly horrific toll. Thousands more on both sides suffered from diseases and conditions that would affect their health for the rest of their lives, long after the last shot was fired. But the strategic significance justified in military terms, outweighed the terrible cost. Guadalcanal represented the turning point where Allied forces shifted from defense to offense in the Pacific. It demonstrated that Japan could be defeated in ground combat. It established air and naval superiority patterns that would characterize the rest of the war, a blueprint for future victory. The story of Japanese troops encountering American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal is ultimately a story about the collision between two fundamentally different approaches to modern warfare. One side believed in the supremacy of the warrior spirit, in courage overcoming material disadvantages, in tactics producing victory regardless of resources. The other side believed in the systematic application of industrial power, in logistics and firepower as force multipliers, in combined arms coordination as the key to success. The jungle of Guadalcanal became the crucible where these conflicting philosophies met in the most brutal way imaginable. The outcome, though it took 6 months of savage, heartbreaking fighting to reach its inevitable conclusion, demonstrated that concentrated fire support and logistics, when combined with competent tactics and determined soldiers, created a form of military power that Japanese forces simply could not match. For the Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and lived to tell their stories, the campaign represented the moment when reality destroyed illusion. They learned that their training had been based on false assumptions. Their tactics had been designed for a different kind of war. Their logistics had been inadequate from the beginning, and their nation was engaged in a conflict it could not win through military means alone. The Americans who fought on Guadalcanal learned different but equally important lessons. They discovered that they could match Japanese soldiers in the brutality of combat. They proved that American industrial power could be translated into military victory. They developed tactics and doctrine for jungle warfare that would serve them well in subsequent campaigns. And they shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility, replacing it with a realistic assessment of a tough, determined, but ultimately defeatable enemy. Guadalcanal was where Japanese troops were terrified, not by American soldiers as individual fighters, though they proved formidable, but by the systematic, overwhelming, relentless application of firepower and material resources that American forces brought to every engagement. It was a terror born not from fear of death, which Japanese soldiers had been trained to accept as a warrior's fate, but from the chilling realization that individual courage and sacrifice were rendered meaningless against an enemy whose supplies never ran out, whose wounded received care, whose artillery never stopped firing, whose aircraft controlled the skies, and whose industrial base could replace losses faster than combat could inflict them. The transformation that began when Japanese forces first encountered American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal marked a fundamental shift in the Pacific War. From that point forward, Japanese forces would be on the defensive, fighting a losing battle against an enemy whose material advantages grew larger with each passing month. The jungle warfare of Guadalcanal became the template for future campaigns, proving that American forces could fight and win in the most difficult terrain against a determined enemy, provided they had adequate logistics, effective coordination, and overwhelming firepower. The ultimate lesson of Guadalcanal is that modern warfare isn't just about heroes and villains, or even individual bravery. It's about the intricate, often unseen, gears of industry, logistics, and systemic coordination, without which even the fiercest warrior spirit can be tragically, systematically crushed.